Go ahead and get a Bible out if you would, or your digital device if you use that, and open up to the book of Revelation. And so that's where we are. We're studying Revelation. I want to begin, though, before we start reading there, is I want to poll the congregation a little bit. I have some questions to ask you, okay? How many of you here this morning have seen the Lord of the Rings movies? Raise your hand if you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies. All right, so keep your hand up. Keep your hand up. All right, now, how many of you have read the books? Oh, okay, so there's the hands right there, right? Okay. All right, so the Lord of the Rings movie. You can include the Hobbits in there too, by the way, if you. Okay, all right, there you go. How about the Chronicles of Narnia? How many have seen the movies? Raise your hand if you've seen the movies. How many have read the books? Okay. How about the Harry Potter movies? Seen any of them? You don't have to see all of them, just seen any of them. How many of you have read the books? All right. Now, I haven't seen any of these, but there's this show that's been on over the last 8 or 9 years on HBO. I've not seen any of them, but it's called Game of Thrones, and it's a very popular fantasy show. It seems like the 2000s and the 2010s, we've seen this resurgence of fantasy adventure, right? In movies and in literature and TV shows. I don't know much about modern fantasy adventure, but I know the classic stuff. And in the classic stuff, it was packed full of symbols. It's packed full of allegory, okay? And it's pretty obvious, for example, those of you who have seen The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? It's pretty obvious what C.S. Lewis is getting at in those books. Spoiler alert, the lion is supposed to represent the lion. Aslan represents Jesus. I took this class when I was in college called Modern Christian Writers, and we studied the works of people like C.S. Lewis, Madeleine L'Engle, J.R.R. Tolkien, and he wasn't as obvious as Lewis, but even if you read through The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien in that series, it's packed full of biblical allusions. It's packed full of types of Jesus, if you read his entire series of books. So what does a good writer do? What does a good storyteller do? A good writer and a good storyteller can do something in our minds that somebody who just comes right out and tells us something can't do, right? A good storyteller does something in our minds that somebody who just comes right out and tells us, they can't do this. Because a good storyteller inspires, right? A good storyteller convicts in ways that other people can't do. Sometimes a good storyteller gets you on his side, right? He brings you in, and then he shares the fact that what he just said applies to you. And I was thinking about this week, and in my mind I went back to the story about Nathan the prophet, when Nathan goes to King David. And Nathan goes there to confront David, but what does he do? Like it's after David's sin, right? David slept with Bathsheba, he got her pregnant, he arranged for her husband to be killed in battle. And he went there to confront David, but he didn't just bust in and say, David, you sinned. What did he do? He told a story, right? So Nathan shows up and he says, hey, David, let me tell you a story. And he told him this story about a man who had one little ewe lamb, and he loved that ewe lamb like a daughter. And there was this other guy who was rich, and he had a whole bunch of lambs. But when he had company came, he took that guy's poor ewe lamb and killed it to feed his guests. And through hearing that story, what did David say? David got angry, and David said, that rich man deserves to die, right? And then what did Nathan say? That's right. It's then that Nathan said, David, hey, you're the rich man. See what the storyteller does? And not everything in Nathan's story has a direct parallel to David's sin, but he was making the point, and Nathan's story made the point. And so when we're reading through the writings of John here in the book of Revelation, John writes to us here in the next several chapters, and here's what I want you to do, okay? In your mind, I want you to think about it like a novel. I want you to think about it kind of like reading Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or those kind of things. And the reason being is there's tons of imagery. And if you read it that way, you get what John's saying, right? It's full of word pictures. It's full of symbols. We've already seen a lot of symbols already. And he, in this section, even calls back to other times he's used these symbols. So open up your Bible, Revelation chapter 12, and it begins this way. A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Pretty fantastic stuff, right? Dragons and war and, all these things going on. But what is John talking about here? It's basically the story of Jesus, the Messiah, coming from the people of Israel. That's who that lady represents, right? It's Jesus coming out of Israel. The story begins with that serpent back in the garden, and now we pick it up here with Israel, and the woman has 12 stars on her head. She's Israel. She brings the Messiah into the world. The dragon tries to destroy him, yet he is taken up to God. And this obviously is not the full story, right? I mean, you can read through the Gospels if you want the full story. It's not telling us the full story because John is getting to a point, so he tells us a really brief synopsis of that. And then he tells us of this war in heaven. The archangel Michael fights the dragon. The dragon is cast out. He and all of his followers are cast to the earth. Okay? Then look at, starting in verse 10. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shriek from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows his time is short." So because of the victory of Jesus, the dragon is cast out of the presence of God, right? The dragon is cast out of heaven. God no longer hears his accusations. He's no longer a corrupting influence in heaven. Those who are in Jesus are perfect in the sight of God. But here's some bad news. Where is the dragon now? Here's the bad news. The dragon is on earth. And in verses 13 through 17, talk about the dragon trying to destroy the woman, but in order to get to her, he goes for some other people. Who does he go for? Her offspring, right? And so here's what's going on here. The woman here is Israel, who brings about the Messiah. She, in these verses, can be seen as, let's be specific, believing Israel, right? Those people who had been faithful to God. Her offspring are those who now believe in Jesus. We're talking about the Christians there, right? And so the dragon has been ousted, and now he is ticked off. And what does he want? He wants revenge. And so now we get to chapter 13, and we are introduced to this unholy trinity, because the dragon brings about two beasts, right? So we see the dragon and we see two beasts. The first beast is a ruler. It's the dragon gives him power and authority on the earth. We talked in earlier sermons about how the Roman emperor was called the beast by many of the Jews back then, right? And many think the reference to the head wounded was the fact that the empire looked like it was going to falter under Emperor Nero, but then it resurged under Vespasian, the emperor. So the dragon brought about these beasts, and the people worshiped the beast. This first beast blasphemes God. He conquers the world. He wages war against God's people for 42 months. Once again, what do we see there? We see the 3.5, right? It's 42 months, it's 3.5 years. We see that pattern again, which means this is testing. But even the testing comes to an end. Verses 9 and 10, here's the counsel given to God's people during this time. Listen to this. You're not going to like this. Here's the counsel that God gives his people during this time of testing. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. What does that mean? Somebody tell me, what does that mean? That's the counsel of God's people during this time of testing. What does that mean? And then he says, this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Man, it's a hard thing to hear, isn't it? During this time of testing, if you're going to be killed, you're going to be killed, he says. If you're going to be taken off into captivity, you're going to be taken off into captivity, God says. And that's a hard thing for God's people to hear. We've talked before about the persecution of Christians. And it's hard for us to think about God letting those people be killed and tortured. And we ask ourselves, how could God let those kind of things happen? Anybody ever question that? Anybody ever wonder about that? How can God let those things happen to good Christian people? And one of the things to keep in mind is that Christian persecution has always been voluntary. All you have to do to not be killed for Jesus is what? Deny Jesus, right? Christian persecution has always been voluntary. All you have to do to not be killed for Jesus is to deny Jesus. But for those who hold to Jesus, we're supposed to have this entirely different perspective. It's like Paul, when Paul writes, like in Romans 8:35, Paul writes, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble, or hardship, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword?" 2 Corinthians 4:16 and 17. After talking about persecution and some people being killed because of their faith, what does he write there? He says, "Therefore, we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away. Inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us eternal glory that far outweighs them all. What I think is interesting there is Paul talks about people being killed for Jesus as light and momentary troubles, right? He calls martyrdom, he calls prison light and momentary troubles. Which brings us really to the theme of the book of Revelation. We've talked about this. Many times we feel like we are on the losing side. And we may ask when God is going to show up, when God is going to set things right. Well, Revelation is written to tell us that God sees what we're going through and he is on his way. In chapter 13, verse 11, man, if one murderous beast is not enough, right? The dragon brings about this other beast. And this one looks like a lamb. But when he speaks, he has the voice of the dragon, right? So he looks like the lamb, but he has the voice of the dragon. The first beast is a ruler. The second beast is a religious leader. He is a false prophet. And he does a lot of miraculous things in these verses. But he doesn't point people to the true God. What does he do? He causes everyone to worship the first beast. And we learned previously that worshiping the beast is also worshiping the dragon, right? And he forces everybody to worship the first beast and even forces them to take a mark. He forces them to take the mark of the first beast. Have we seen marking yet at all or sealing yet at all in Revelation? Anybody remember? Has anybody been marked in Revelation yet? We've seen marking or sealing. God sealed people for himself in chapter 7, didn't he? They were the 144,000. They are faithful people from the tribes of Israel. He marks them. And here you see the beast marking people. He's laying his claim on these people. There are a lot of ideas out there about the number of the beast. But what's interesting in the original language is that the word here for man actually is neutral. So your translation may say it's the number of a man. But in the original language, it says this is the number of mankind. Right? So whatever specific thing that John is going for here, it's an obvious contrast between the marking of God that we found out earlier and now the marking of humanity or the marking of the beast or the marking of the world and its priorities. And so we get to chapter 14, and in chapter 14 we start to see the significance of the 144,000 people. Okay? Remember, that number is 12 times 12,000. It represents the Old Testament faithful people. And here is why they're brought up again and how they are symbolically important here. Look at this. This is chapter 14. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. So they had been marked for God. And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like the loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of a harpist playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. So this is a special group of people, right? And what makes them so special? The answer to that question is going to speak to us, and it's going to speak to the Christians that John's writing to. Christians who are going to face persecution. Christians who will face the pressure to give in and go along with the world. Verse 4. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remain virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. So there are 144,000 from the tribes of Israel And the imagery here is that they have remained pure, right? Now, it might mean that they did not defile themselves by engaging in the immoral worship of other gods. When it talks about not sleeping with women, it might mean they didn't throw in with worship of false gods and sexual immorality and all those things, right? And we've spoken before about how John takes a lot of imagery and he uses a lot of imagery from the Old Testament. But this whole concept of being marking, like he's borrowing here from Ezekiel 8 and 9. And if we go back to Ezekiel the prophet, there's this one section where Ezekiel is in the temple and he's told, God tells him, I want you to dig a hole in the wall of the temple, okay? So he digs a hole in the wall of the temple, and it's big enough now that he can put his head through. And he puts his head through the wall, and he sees in the temple this secret room, okay? And in this secret room, he saw the elders of Israel. And what were they doing in this secret room? They were gathering together, and they were worshiping false gods in this room in the temple, okay? And here's what Ezekiel is told in chapter 9. Then I heard him call out in a loud voice, bring near those who were appointed to execute judgment in the city, each with a weapon in his hand. Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been and moved to the threshold of the temple. Then the Lord called to the man clothed with linen who had the writing kit at his side. And he said to him, go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark. See, here's where we're playing in. Here's where we're getting that borrowing of the mark, right? And put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it. And as I listened, he said to the others, follow him through the city and kill without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter the old men, the young men, the women, the mothers, the children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. Beginning at my sanctuary, so they began with the old men who were in front of the temple. Anybody, you get what's happening there? Go through the city. Anybody who just doesn't agree with all of the idol worship that's going on, you mark them for God. Then they follow through, and anybody that doesn't have the mark, they get killed, right? It's pretty harsh stuff. But pay attention to who is marked here. Those who are grieved at the sin of the people in Jerusalem, right? And so here's what I believe about these 144,000 people. These 144,000 people are marked for the Lord, and it represents all those Israelites who lived throughout history who were grieved at the sin of their people, right? Example, when Israel is worshiping the golden calf at the foot of Mount Sinai, most of the people, what were they doing? They got up, they were participating in the revelry, they were worshiping the false god. Surely there was somebody there. Surely there was somebody there who said, this isn't a good idea, right? God's not going to like this. When they fell into idol worship at Peor before they went into the promised land, surely there was somebody there who said, Yahweh's going to get mad at this, and so they abstained. They didn't do it. And so throughout the history of Israel, there always has been this remnant of faithful people. And though the nation fell into sin, though some of them physically perished in the destruction sent by God, He has remembered them, and they have a special place, and they have a special song. Right? And what does that say now to those people who are persecuted today? What is God telling us about them say to those people who are persecuted today? Because that's what John goes on to talk about. Those Christians who face persecution. God sees it. God remembers it. Don't think it's gone unnoticed. God sees your faithfulness. And then He sums all of it up by talking about three angels. And they bring three messages. Verses 6 and 7, one messenger brings the gospel and calls the people of the earth to worship the true God, not the beast, the true God. Verse 8, he proclaims that Babylon is fallen. Why would that be significant? Babylon represents the evil world system that oppresses the righteous. Remember the Old Testament? Judah was carried off by the Babylonians. Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. Well, the proclamation is that Babylon has fallen. In verses 9 through 11, the message is that anyone who worships the beast is going to share in his punishment. And that brings to light the fact that what we think of as hell is something that actually was originally created for the dragon, right? Hell was created for Satan and his followers. And we'll see that later on in the book. But what the messenger says here is that if you align yourself with the beast, you will share in the fate of the beast and the fate of the dragon. And then John writes again here in verse 12, and he repeats himself, which makes me think this is probably the point of the section, right? Because he repeats himself. He says, this calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keeps his commands and remain faithful to Jesus. Because that phrase is repeated, I can't help but think that's the point of the section. You, faithful follower of Jesus, are going to have to be patient through what's going to come your way. You, as a faithful follower of Jesus, are going to have to be patient when they treat you unfairly, patient when they slander you, patient when they take your possessions, patient when they kill those close to you, even to the point of you losing your life. And then John writes, and then I heard a voice from heaven say, write this. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. He's not excluding those who died in the Lord before this. He's just saying that those who are persecuted because of their faith in Jesus, they will be remembered just like the faithful in the past. And what happens to those who remain faithful till the end? What happens to those who remain faithful to the end? What happens when we follow the example of those faithful believers in God who grieve and lament over the detestable things that are done? Though now we patiently endure, there's a day when we will rest. We'll not have to endure persecution ever again. And when it says our deeds will follow us, here it means that faithfulness to Jesus will not be forgotten. Faithfulness to Jesus will not be forgotten. God will not overlook it. This morning we're going to sing a song of decision. If you're here today and you want to make a decision for the Lord, you come forward as we all stand up together and as we sing.